Hey everybody, Phantom139 here, and welcome back to my State of Destiny 2 video series. For those of you who are new here, this is my seasonal to bi-seasonal update video on where I feel the game currently stands, and to offer my personal feedback on the biggest issues I think Bungie needs to focus in on the short term and the long term. Today we actually won't have any long-term feedback, it's mainly going to be short-term feedback. Before we get to any of that, though, I first wanted to acknowledge some recent events here on the channel. A few weeks ago, I put together a video on where I felt the state of the Warlock class was as a result of one of my clanmates poking fun at the new Warlock aspect for Strand. And as of recording this video, 26,000 of you have watched it, a number I can't even begin to fathom for one of my Destiny 2 videos. A lot of the conversation that followed the video was great too. That was actually one of the main goals of the video, to start a discussion. Yes, I am perfectly aware that some of my ideas would be completely overpowered if introduced exactly as mentioned, and that was actually the idea, to be overpowered in nature such that people would bring it up and then offer their suggestions and be like, maybe that's too much, how about this instead? And a lot of you actually did that, so thank you very much for participating in that discussion. You have pushed things so much further than I even hoped to do with that video. And a lot of the subsequent ideas that followed in the discussion were very good too. I'm very glad to see that the video gained as much traction as it did. Now, I won't lie, I did get a chuckle out of some of the salty comments, or the folks who obviously got salty, and then even saltier when they wrote up their insult to me, and decided to throw multiple insults my way. Now, clearly, if you're spending time to shoot the messenger, then it must be pushing the right buttons, per se. Also, as an addendum, for those who thought they would insult me off the platform or the game, I teach upper-level college classes for a living. You're not going to guilt-shame me in any way. I deal with whiny college kids on a daily basis, and you are nothing like them. If anything, you're only showing your personal ignorance to the topic, so thank you very much. On the flip side, however, there was one comment that I got that asked me to analyze the other two classes as well as I did for Warlock, and I can definitely do that. In fact, I'm going to change my schedule around to actually make videos on the shortcomings that the Hunter and Titan classes are also experiencing right now. Surprise, surprise, folks, I actually play all three classes. I'm not just only a Warlock player. I do play all three classes, and I do have my own thoughts on where the other two classes are lacking as well right now. I will forgo suggestions this time because a lot of you had confusion in what you thought were some of my conflicting thoughts, but I will revisit this topic in a few weeks once I've had some more time to analyze some of the more shortcomings. Some of my criticisms that I brought up in the Warlock video were also hit with the Season of the Deep release. I'll revisit some of those points later on in the video here, but for now, let's actually jump into the primary focus of today's video. And we will start with my final thoughts on Season of Defiance. So, another yearly expansion and another shorthand season to go along with it. Last year we had Risen, which did better from a story perspective, but did fall a little short on the later end. So, let's talk about how Season of Defiance did. And like always, I'll follow along with my usual rating scale for seasons. For the story, Bungie did actually a pretty good job here. I give them an 8 out of 10 for the story. They did improve upon last year's introduction by having things last a little longer, and also branching off to a few side tracks that augmented the expansion story, although briefly. Marasov returned and granted us the power to traverse the Ascendant Plane in order to infiltrate pyramid strongholds that were being tied to the Shadow Legion to rescue captives, and this was a process that involved the introduction of 3 new battlegrounds and a set of seasonal story missions that accompanied this. At the same time, a side story developed in the EDZ with a Vex node that was accessed, granting us backdoor access into the Vex network, where we found out that Asher Mir was still kicking in a way. This was a character that disappeared back in Season of Rivals. The mission was a nice nod back to the past with references to past content, and had a concluding story bit talking a bit about the Vex simulations of the Veil, that mystery story object that we have yet to learn fully about. The seasonal story continued to push forward character connections, albeit maybe a little bit of foreshadowing in week 2. And then the kicker was delivered in the final beat where we lost Amanda, one of the series' most beloved characters next to Cade 6. I did feel the end of season mission was a little weak story-wise, as we didn't actually fight alongside our allies. We only got a little bit of a quick peek through a window to one of the action scenes. And then I also had to deal with a couple of game crashing issues during this mission, but otherwise, not bad. So all in all, I'd say the story was probably the strong point of Season Defiance, and it was done pretty well. Next up, we have the Endgame category, and unfortunately, Bungie's going to lose quite a bit of points here, and they're down to 4 out of 10 in my personal opinion. I spent a little bit of time discussing my thoughts on the recent difficulty adjustments in my Thoughts on Lightfall video, and a lot of these really came to pasture in the endgame this season. Capping light levels outside of Grandmaster content effectively removed my desire to engage with most of the endgame content outside of seals, titles, and Guardian rank objectives. I had no desire to Sherpa master level content this season, which is really a shame, seeing as this is something that I really enjoyed doing in past seasons after I had finished all of my things. It was nice to be able to kind of hand back to the community, but unfortunately this time around, given the difficulty changes, it really turned everything into a checklist. So complete the activity one time to knock off the checklist, and then never touch it again. So unfortunately, Bungie, this really goes against the idea of making content that is replayable. This is also the first season in recent memory that I ended with a seasonal rank below 250. I think the last time that happened was Season of the Worthy. This was also the first time I didn't have all of the ritual ornaments done by mid-season. The last 2 ornaments I had, I actually got in the last week of the season. I was actually picking up the last ornament of the ritual weapon on the very last night of the season. That just goes to show Bungie how unmotivated I was to engage with things this time around. Because the endgame was no longer fun and engaging, that means I also dropped ritual activities. Grandmasters this time around, it was a bit rough at first, but thanks to some targeted adjustments to enemy spawns in the battlegrounds, things did improve a little later on, giving my friends and myself our usual fun batch of challenges. And thankfully, that's something that's probably going to continue, but like I said, that's probably the only thing that's going to continue. Grind-wise, not much change here. We're still at 5. It's another season, still pinnacle grinding away, and we're still dealing with a flawed random drop system. Yes, I'm well aware of the leaks that people have talked about regarding changes to the level systems coming in the final shape, but this video is about the here and now, and we are still doing pinnacle RNG. Exotic armor hunting, although some changes were made in Season of the Deep, remember this is feedback for Season of Defiance, so we still had to deal with lost sectors, and unfortunately that means that the pools were still heavily inflated. Now, Bungie did add a mean to acquire exotics through a public event, the Vex Strike Force. However, the rarity of this event meant that you could easily pass one by, and if by chance the Vex event area actually lined up with where terminal overload was occurring on a day, then that means that you couldn't actually get that event on that particular day. So it's like every couple of days, you won't be able to even have that event happen. For exotics, Season 20, there is a rating of 7 out of 10 for this season, so exotics are pretty good for the season. Season 20, there were a number of exotic weapons and armor pieces. Some of them were tied to the expansion, and others were tied to the season. So since this video is only focused on the season, I'm only going to review the seasonal exotics. I will say, however, that just like last year with the Witch Queen, the armor pieces that did release alongside the expansion were better than the usual seasonal release counterparts. So if we can see more pieces like that, then we'll still be on the right track. Weapon-wise, what we got for Season of Defiance were Verglis Curve and Vex Caliber. So Verglis Curve, that's an exotic stasis bow in which kills grant you stasis arrows that then, when hip-fired, spawn a crystal or freeze a target. You were allowed to store 5 of these and then launch them all at once if you wanted to. Now, this particular bow might not seem like much at first, but it has some incredible synergy with stasis crystal builds, and I actually had a ton of fun using this with some of those stasis crystal builds. So this one actually does get a pretty good thumbs up in my book, and I'm hoping that we see more like this in the future. Now, the other exotic Came from the Vex Avalon mission, and like Revision Zero, this was a weapon that was crafted and then had a number of catalysts and upgrades that were tied to return trips to the mission. Vexcalibur is a void glaive that fires a void burst that is very similar to a wyvern shot, and then its shield generates a small wall that grants you and allies an overshield, and then your personal overshield can be refreshed by getting further kills with the glaive. Now, I don't use glaives that much because I still think they're kind of in a okay-ish place, but they're not like really great. So I didn't have too much time to experiment with this weapon, but obviously having an exotic that has customizability due to its crafted nature does owe cadence to it being a more valuable choice. Gameplay wise, this is going to be tied straight to the end game, so also, unfortunately, 4 here. And this should follow along with the notion I provided from before. But when you have a lackluster end game that has low engagement, then the overall flow of the game is also not going to be very engaging. I did feel that the overall flow of gameplay this season felt a lot slower, and I think more time is really going to be needed to allow the whole armor mod system changes to completely shake out and to have more mods added that replace old favorites. But I really just can't help but shake this feeling that we suffered a significant downgrade compared to our old builds. Seasonal artifact, we're back down to 12 unlocks. However, now it is passive perks. This is something that I'm okay and not okay with at the same time. I do like having the perks be passive bonuses, but one of the big feedback points from a while ago was that being able to go through all the mods is what made it actually kind of fun. And I understand Bungie wanting to limit the perks from being too powerful, but still, some of the mods I take one look at and then I don't even bother with it. Some of the artifact mods were fun to play with last season, especially the Shield Break Orb Spawner in the Battlegrounds, where void shields were everywhere, and basically I could turn the ground into a glowing savanna of super recharge. And then there were other things that, I didn't even bother touching the entire season because it just bored me. On the topic of abilities and mods, we can definitely talk about the loss of elemental wells and changes that were made to replace them. Now, elemental wells, that was a fun concept and had a much more in-depth build control to it, not to mention being absolutely fun from an ability loop perspective, but the replacements that we got in the subclass nodes are so much weaker. They only provide benefits to one of your abilities, and then they have exceptionally long cooldowns that basically make them not even worth using. So I didn't even bother using some of those new fragments that spawned those elemental effects because I just don't really see the point of them. Now, the new destination, it's not really that fun to engage with. Even following the adjustments to the one-shot kill Thresher Doom ships, trying to progress any weapon level or work on a bounty on Neomuna is just not a fun task. The enemies are just too spongy. I've said this before, I'll say it again. If I want to fight bullet sponges and play a slower game that requires me to think more tactically, I'll go play Division 2. I don't play Destiny 2 for that kind of an experience. I play Destiny 2 to blow up large hordes of aliens with overpowered abilities. Now, going through the motions of Strand was probably one of the highlights of the season, as Strand did feel pretty good on release for all 3 classes. Now, some of the release aspects did feel a little weak, but I think this is more of an issue with the Strand objects themselves, such as Threadlings being very weak, and then Tangles outside of the seasonal mods doing too little damage. Finally, the last category is the event, which this one should come as no surprise for veterans of the channel here. 3 out of 10, I really don't need to discuss anything about here. I'm just going to pretty much copy and paste my feedback from last year, because it's basically the same thing. Bungie, get rid of Guardian games. Nobody cares about it. There is nothing competitive about it. And honestly, this year was probably even worse than previous years. I don't know who had the bright idea of going from one extreme of matchmaking to the other extreme of matchmaking for supremacy, but this was some of the worst Crucible I have ever subjected myself to. Now, usually after finishing an objective in Destiny 2 that annoys me, I'm able to just brush off some steam by jumping into another part of the game and then just blowing off some steam. Not this time. Oh, not this time. After I finished my last Supremacy game for the Triumph, I turned the game off and I walked away for the rest of the day. That's how angry I was at Supremacy. So please, Bungie, do everyone a favor and scrap Guardian games. Just get rid of it. The Revelry was so much better of an event. It was just redecorated Infinite Forest with some fun perks for us to use and mess around with in the game for a few weeks. It was so much more enjoyable than anything Guardian games has ever been. So, rounding it out, you add it all up and then average it out, we're back to a 5 out of 10 for the seasonal release. Defiance had the chance to differentiate itself from previous expansion release seasons with a much stronger seasonal story, but the gameplay changes that released alongside the season deflated engagement in the endgame, slowed down the flow of the game as a whole, and then anything that was left was completely eviscerated by Guardian games. Now, I know it's probably not fair of me to blast a season for the difficulty changes, but given the fact that those changes directly affected my engagement with the seasonal content as a result of lower amount of playtime in the rest of the game as a whole, then I kind of really have no choice here. So that's basically my final thoughts on Season of Defiance. So let's go ahead and shift gears now and let's talk about the here and now. So Season of the Deep. So let's talk about Season of the Deep. Thus far, we've only gotten 2 weeks of new content to play around with. So far, it's pretty good. The seasonal story revolves around the return of the Titan destination, with 2 brand new seasonal activities, Salvage and Deep Dives. The Sloan character is back, along with the Drifter, who is leading the charge on the seasonal interaction with Asha, the Leviathan that we saw roaming the seas on Titan way back in year 1 of Destiny 2. Now, Bungie did add a mission on Neomuna to try to explain some of the story gaps in Lightfall regarding the Veil. We're only 2 weeks in, and there really hasn't been anything that we haven't already heard from the story, so I guess we'll see. If you really want a lot of story information and something that really should have been in the Lightfall experience from the get-go, there is a leaked cutscene going around online regarding the origin of the Witness and the Darkness. I'm not going to spoil it here, but it has so much more pertinent information that really should have been part of the Lightfall campaign from the get-go. Switching gears, let's talk about the Season of the Deep activities. Salvage. This is the first activity that is this year's take on Menagerie, with a series of mini encounters that lead up to a final boss fight. The game mode also introduces a mechanic from roguelike games where you are fighting against a timer before you get booted from the activity. In the case of this activity, you're pushed forward to the boss fight with lower rewards. The number of mini encounters this time around feels a lot better compared to previous years, and the addition of multiple areas where you start and then progress through throws that added bit of randomness to the activity that makes it feel a bit more lasting compared to previous year's iterations on this. About the only thing that feels off about Salvage right now is the number of enemies in the lead-up encounters. At times, it can feel very low for a 6-player activity, so I think Bungie should take a look at the amount of enemies and maybe bump things up a little bit. The other new activity is the Deep Dives, and there are 2 versions of the Deep Dives. There is the weekly curated story, and then a secondary version, which is a roguelike randomized mission variant. Now, this randomized mission variant is what I want to spend the most time talking about, because this is an excellent addition to the game. This is the kind of thing I was really hoping the Infinite Forest would have been way back in year 1. So it's great to see an activity like this finally coming to fruition. About my only criticism with the Deep Dive right now is the activation of the pressure trials in match-made versions, because you have to have all teammates activate the taken node, which can be incredibly difficult to do. So I think having it changed to where one person activates the node and then it becomes a vote mechanic to either activate or not should be the thing to go forward. Finally, fishing. I think this one will come off as a little bit of a sleeping surprise here, This is actually a fun little mini game break from the game that does offer some nice rewards if you get lucky enough. RNG in this seems to be very hit and miss with this activity and is about the only thing I'd like to see adjusted, as it directly influences the fishing buff for the region. Now, I know a lot of people are complaining about the public event resetting the fishing buff, but this really isn't something I'm too irked about because I do understand needing to have that reset. But due to the fact that RNG can be very stingy at times, it can make getting to maximum tier on fishing buff very hard to do sometimes. And I think that's where the feedback needs to be a little more focused on, is the RNG drops of some of the fish. All right, next up, we have a brand new dungeon released, Ghosts of the Deep. Now we continue with the trend of a 3 encounter dungeon with 2 bosses split by a mechanics teaching encounter. This time around, the central mechanic of the dungeon is identifying a correct rune and then interacting with that correct rune in some way, shape, or form, with the interaction changing from encounter to encounter. Aesthetically, this is probably my favorite of all the dungeons that have released thus far. The atmosphere was absolutely amazing. The armor sets are beautiful. It is an absolute step up compared to the brand sets we have been getting with previous dungeons. Now, weapon-wise, on the other hand, I'm not that impressed. Now, there are some unique items in there, like a special stasis waveframe grenade launcher, but none of the perk rolls really excite me compared to some of the other weapons, and I'm also still of the mindset that these should also be craftable, but I digress. It seems like Bungie wants them to not be. Challenge-wise, this dungeon is up there with Duality, but more so due to the high density of enemies compared with Duality's physics, which is a lot better of a challenge. I think the length to damage window is a bit lengthy for my personal taste, especially as it pertains to solo runs, but not every dungeon encounter needs to be Akalos, so that's alright. I will say something does feel a bit off about the first boss fight though. I could be mistaken, but having adds that infinitely respawn the instant you kill the last one seems a bit strange and perhaps bugged. About that, the only other thing that I have a major criticism with is the boss's health pools. Both bosses exceed 10 million health if you factor in the additional 600,000 HP shield that you need to crack each time. Now, while dungeons are being made with 3-player groups in mind, the solo experience has become something of a secondary aspect of a dungeon release, and extensive health pools do not make a dungeon harder, it just makes it more tedious and annoying. Now, this was a big feedback point that was given to Bungie in the previous dungeon, and it seems like Bungie doubled down instead of listening to any of the feedback. I think if a solo player is able to complete 3 phases of a boss's mechanics, then they have demonstrated mastery. Now, there are a lot of discussions going around the Reddit right now, particularly pertaining to employing the scaling mechanic that is used in the Legendary campaign. And this would work, but I would offer a different suggestion, and I would offer the suggestion of using a reverse health gate instead. So how this would work is if you are a solo player, then you get 3 damage phases. So how it would work is you complete a damage phase and then a reverse health gate would kick in for 34% of the health. So in a normal damage phase, you get a limited amount of time to damage the boss, and then the whole thing resets. But with the reverse health gate idea, what would happen is the damage phase would start, and then it would not end until you hit that threshold of damage. And then after you hit that threshold of damage, it stops. At the same time, there would be the internal timer for the normal damage phase that would still be going. So if you actually exceed that health gate, as in you're doing really good damage, you're showing even more mastery over your build, your weapons, and all that stuff, then you were allowed to do even more damage. So in a way, it would work similar to the health gates on the Caretaker boss fight, only the damage phase would continue until you hit that minimal threshold. This would actually lock down rotations to 3 per boss for solos, and then perhaps you could do the same for duos, but I think for 3s, you don't use this mechanic, you just use the timed health fates. So all in all, great dungeon. I hope we do get some changes to the health for the bosses and maybe some additions that make it a little easier for solos, but otherwise, definitely a thumbs up in my book. Finally, Season of the Deep brought in a number of gameplay updates and changes. Let's talk about the new stuff first, and then I'll cover some quick updates to the old. Aspect-wise, 3 new strand aspects. I hit the Warlock one pretty spot on in my last video, so nothing to talk about there. Hunters, you got Threaded Spectre. It spawns a decoy when you dodge, which damages and spawns threadlings. It's a little bit flashy, but it has 2 very big flaws. The aggro effect right now is a bit inconsistent, so it doesn't always pull the aggro away from you, and the ads will still attack you. And then it spawns threadlings. Threadlings are weak right now, so I think we still need to talk about having a more larger scale buff to threadlings before we can pass any further judgment on it. Titans won the aspect lottery this season with Flechette Storm. They gain the ability to slide uppercut into a rapid combo, and then they can continue to use melee to launch unravel projectiles forward repeatedly, which grants synergy with other continual damage options like Osteostriga. So definitely the best of the 3 this season, and that's pretty much it. We'll just have to wait and see what comes next. 3 new exotic armor pieces released this season, and then 3 new exotic weapons as well. We'll talk about the armor first. Hunters, you got Triton Vice. This enhances performance with glaives. This is one of those highly situational exotic pieces I discussed in my Warlock video. Even the potency of this piece, however, though, it still feels very lacking. I think the only glaive where I can maybe give this an okay pass on is Edge of Concurrence, but now you're talking about needing 2 exotic pieces to even make this work. The melee damage buff is 30%. Syntheseps, on the other hand, for Titans, that's a 50% damage buff. So this is probably the weakest of the 3 new exotics and is going to need some rehashing later on. Titans, you got Arbor Warden. This allows you to use your barricade ability to grant a grenade that, when thrown, spawns the barricade object at that hit location. It's a bit gimmicky since it slots to your grenade spot, but there are some applications of being able to throw a barricade at a distance, even more so since the effects of your subclass modifications will apply to the barricade as well. Meaning you could throw a void barricade to provide an overshield to your teammates, or a strand barricade to reach even further with Denger's Lash. Kind of a hit and miss exotic for me. Feels a little lacking. It has some potential, but it feels like there's something that it needs. I'm not sure how exactly you could change it, but it needs a little more of a bump. Finally, Warlock's Pride Rock Mask. Cenotaph Mask. That's right. This one provides a set of benefits for using trace rifles, which include auto refill while holding a trace rifle. Additionally, when you hit a high tier enemy, it marks them, and if an ally kills that enemy, spawns heavy ammo for that player and then special ammo for the wearer. Now, the description does say that you need to match the element of the trace rifle with your subclass, but as of right now, you do not, and I hope this behavior remains. While this is another one of those highly situational pieces that I usually rant against, unlike previous ones, this one has added team-based support benefits, and those benefits outweigh the cons. This exotic basically gives you the benefits of Aeons, however at range, which is an incredibly potent tool in high-tier content. I think this is going to be a hit in Grandmasters this season, so this one does get a thumbs up for me in the performance category, but it does get a hell of a big thumbs down in the design category. Like, seriously, who thought this would be a good idea? So, Bungie, you're going to need to make an ornament for this thing, and it's going to have to be made sooner rather than later. Weapon-wise, I can only review what I have, which is the Seasonal Exotic Centrifuge. This auto rifle has built-in arc effects when you charge up by running or remaining in combat. It does have some niche applications, but I don't really see it fitting into any in-game loadouts anytime soon, but it's a Season Pass exotic. I don't expect it to be a top-tier exotic in the in-game. I don't have the dungeon exotic yet, but having strand effects on a trace rifle sounds great. There is also another exotic coming later in the season. It is a stasis scout rifle called Wicked Implement. This will apply slow on precision hits. It will spawn stasis crystals when you get precision kills, and it will have a catalyst that when you collect stasis shards, you can overflow the magazine. This weapon sounds like it has some interesting synergy with stasis crystal builds, so I guess we'll see when it comes out. Finally, there was a large number of exotic armor pieces and weapons that were rehashed this season. I haven't had time to test all of them yet. Most of the changes were pretty good. When I have some more time to test this over the course of the season, I can revisit this topic in August when we have the final thoughts of Season 21 video. So that leaves us with the subclass tuning. Now, most of the changes with the seasonal release focused on either bumping up fragment counts on aspects that needed them, applying a damage resistance buff to supers, or adding a damage scaler to supers. Now, were many of these changes, they were a step in the right direction, but there are still many things that are very underperforming. Good example, Arc Warlock supers. This was one of the first things I tested when the season launched was Chaos Reach to see just how much of an effect the jolting strikes would have. I was able to get off about 10 of these on a single target, with each jolt strike dealing about 75% of the base damage of the super. The damage, however, has much to be desired still. I can still go to Neomuna at Terminal Overload, pick up the Cranium, and deal more damage with the Cranium than my super. That's just wrong. And this feedback relating to supers having a lack of damage applies to a number of other Warlock supers, and a lot of other supers in general. Void supers in particular, for all of the classes, are in a very rough spot. They deal a very low damage number compared to all other supers. A number of supers are also heavily reliant on an exotic being slotted to have any use as well. This includes things like Arc Staff, Chaos Reach, Dawn Blade, Spectral Blade, Storm Trance, and Thunder Crash. By default, a super should not require you to have to slot an exotic armor piece to be viable. Adding a benefit to your super is one thing, but requiring the exotic to be able to use your super in the endgame should not be a thing. I'll talk about this a bit more for Hunters and Titans in the coming weeks. I already hit that with Warlocks in my last video, but this is definitely something that I really want Bungie to go back and change. Like, make supers actually be useful without requiring an exotic to make it useful. So that is my feedback right now as it pertains to Season of the Deep. So that leaves us with what I feel is the biggest problem in the game right now, and I'm going to quickly revisit my thoughts on Lightfall video as it pertains to level deltas on activities. Capping power level in activities removes the motivation to push for activity engagement to level up your seasonal artifact power, which, as a direct result, reduces engagement in the game. As an added negative, high-tier content loses out on replayability. Most players now treat it as a checklist instead of something to come back to. You play the activity once to finish the triumph, and then you never do it again. I already mentioned in the Lightfall video how this applies negative pressure on the Sherpa scene, since fewer players actually want to replay a master level activity. There are fewer opportunities for newer players to get in. If you want a good example of this, hop on the LFG right now and look for a Master Room Nightmares post, a raid that released just 3 months ago. This lack of desire can be shown in an even larger example by looking at what happened this past weekend. A bug was discovered in the new dungeon. LFG posts were flooded with people who were trying to get into the Master Dungeon at the final boss just to kill the boss on Master, just to get the triumph so they never had to do that again. Do you think anyone's going to want to actively engage in Master now, and for what? A piece of Artifice armor that has generally lower stat totals than a piece you get in normal for an added mod node for 3+ stats? There's no incentive, Bungie. Hell, I'll push this even further. So many of those same content creators who are whining about the lack of difficulty in the game are now the same people who are whining about the bosses having too much health in the new dungeon. So, really? Look, I understand that some people enjoy being challenged by the game, but for so many others, they don't. Destiny is a video game. It's supposed to be fun. The past few years of the game may have had some flaws, but power levels were not one of them. Being able to actively play the game to the point where you could match or exceed high-level content gave purpose to the grind, it gave a sense of progression, and it gave a sense of constantly feeling more powerful. That feeling is gone. So I'll make the push again. High level content does not need power level deltas. The only thing that should have a power level delta in the game is Grandmasters, Legendary campaigns, and maybe the Vanguard playlist. Everything else does not need a power level delta. So there we have it. First State of Destiny 2 video for the Lightfall year. Not really as bad as some of my previous ones. I think Bungie just needs to revisit level deltas, take a second look at some of the things in the new dungeons, and buff up some underperforming aspects and supers. But otherwise, we're on a pretty good track. Although Season 20 did end a little on the rough side, that first look at Season of the Deep looks to be very promising, and I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what the rest of the season has to offer. It looks like it's going to be a pretty good season. Now, as mentioned, there will probably be 2 more videos from me for Destiny regarding my thoughts on Hunters and Titans, and then we'll probably have a bit of a break for Destiny content until the final shape reveal in August. So that's going to do it for today's video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see everyone next time.